Hi, I'm Kurt Hyde, and I'm an election integrity expert, and I'm also a writer for the New American Magazine. And what I'd like to show you today are some pieces of antique election equipment, and we'll talk about these pieces of equipment and these other artifacts and show how they helped to prevent the stuffing of the ballot box. So throughout history, there have been many different ways of voting, and you can see them here. But one of the things that we might want to take a look at is how do you safeguard from stuffing the ballot box? That is stuffing by the voters, but also to prevent stuffing by the voting officials who might want to try to get their bosses reelected. So the first thing I'd like to show you is this coin. This is a Roman coin over here, and this particular coin is a denarius, and what it does is it shows a Roman citizen voting. Now, this was the Roman experiment with the secret ballot. So each voter would get one tablet. He would then write down his choice on that tablet, and then he would walk over to the receptacle, the little basket or whatever. He would actually turn this tablet, if he wanted to, in a secret ballot election, he would turn it away from people so they would not see how he was voting. But he would walk over to the basket in front of all these people, and that is where he would drop it. While he dropped it into there, that was how the other voters who were there were able to make sure that there was only one tablet dropped at a time. So there were also some guards or other voting officials who were there to make sure. They were also inspecting it to be sure only one vote was being cast per voter. And of course, every bit of the process was open to the public, and the overseeing guards did add a little extra security to what we saw, and just to make sure that nobody stuffed the ballot box. Now, the next artifact I'd like to show you is this. This is a viva voce voting sheet, also known as a poll list. Viva voce means in your live voice. This was a non-secret ballot, and these were, of course, available to the public to purchase if you wanted to get a history of how anybody voted. So in a viva voce poll list, the first thing you'll see over here is the names of the voters, and this is exactly how they voted. This is actually an 1844 presidential election in Illinois. And even though they voted that many years ago, there still is this record of how they voted. Notice that you'll see how they kept the running totals in there. Everything was done in public. So if anybody wanted to attempt to stuff the ballot box to add some voters to this, it would have required adding extra names. And you could go see those people and say, hey, did you vote? And if the man said, it was all men back then, and if the man said, no, I didn't vote, that was part of what kept these things from being, from stuffing the ballot box in this case. I might also add, if you like, this is from Illinois. It's from 1844. And if you like to take a look at little details, this particular document, you might notice that one of the people running for presidential elector, the number 2 man here on the Whig ticket, was Abraham Lincoln. This is actually one of the earliest, it's not the earliest, but it's one of the earliest known documents where Abraham Lincoln was running for office. Viva voce voting was considered by most people to be the safest from fraud at virtually every kind of election fraud possible, whether it be stuffing the ballot box, altering the ballot box, illegal voters, all of those things. But there was one weakness, and that was because there was this public record of exactly how you voted, it did open the door for intimidation and retaliation. And there were enough acts of intimidation and retaliation that eventually that was the downfall of viva voce voting, because people did prefer to go for the secret ballot. Another form of voting, we don't have an example of it here on the table, was voting by standing. And when you voted by standing, you might be standing in a field and they would see how big the different groups were. You could be standing in a room where people would be standing along one wall, and the voters for the other candidate would be against another wall, and you could count the people by standing. Another way was to have people sitting, and you'd say all those who want to vote for a certain candidate will stand up now, and then count off your numbers. That's where we get some of these ideas of, you might hear some of the expressions in our language that are still left over from that era. Things like he's a stand-up man, or where do you stand, and other such things. Those issues can be traced back to that voting by standing. It was usually possible to check for an ineligible voter because the people were there. It was conducted in public. It was very important that everything was known, that the vote totals were known right away. Everything was verifiable by either the candidates or the voters themselves. But that was voting by standing, and that's how we kept people from stuffing the ballot box in that particular regard. Now, what happened next was that people did want the secret ballot. And the first thing that came along was tickets. And here are some tickets here. These are actual, real tickets from the era. The whole idea was that the tickets were originally designed in order to have a secret ballot. But as you can see by these tickets right here, they're not the same shape. They're not the same color. And the other thing about some of them is that sometimes these tickets were printed on newspapers or by newspapers. And as you can see, even if you turn this ticket over on the other side, you've probably got something recognizable about it that will take away the secret ballot. But they did accomplish secret balloting to a point. This is when we started to run some of our security measures, such as once you go to the secret ballot, you had to make sure that you counted the number of voters, you had a list of who they were, and that you had to count the number of ballots to be sure that nobody stuffed the ballot box with any extra ballots. One of the things that happened, and a lot of it, as far as I can see, the earliest occurrences of this were the early 1850s in Massachusetts. And the ballot envelope was here. Now, in this case, these two ballots or tickets are truly identical, so you probably could achieve the secret ballot. But the idea is that if you had a ticket like this and a ticket like this, but you were able to put them into a ballot ticket, into a ballot envelope, such as this one, you would then be able to achieve a certain amount of anonymity, and that's how you'd get the secret ballot. Now, the other thing is, so that's how we went for the secret ballot. Well, how did we keep people from stuffing the ballot box? Well, the point was that when you opened those envelopes, you'd make sure there was only one ballot in there. And a typical penalty for anybody who tried to slip in an extra ballot was that both ballots would be thrown out because you weren't supposed to vote more than one ballot. And then another thing that came along was the glass ballot box. This particular one is an Amos Pettibone glass ballot box. The glass added some protection. As you can see, there are already a couple ballots in this one, but you could see for sure, especially when it was first empty. Another thing was there were rumors. How truthful were they? I don't know. Probably, but it was a concern in people's minds, was that there were false bottoms in some of these ballot boxes, and they were all opaque wood ballot boxes. And so having the glass helped to assure the people that, that you didn't have anything like that. So that was a way to keep people from stuffing the ballot box and to also help people know that everything was done right. The paper ballot box also led to some more procedures. Now, in this particular picture, we can see a voting scene with the glass ballot boxes, but I'd like to turn your attention to some of the facts that you might be seeing in this picture. Now, this particular lithograph from 1872 shows that an African American was voting, okay? And even in some of the northern states, they were restricted, not maybe completely, but partially restricted until the Constitution was amended. But take a look at that. Some people will look at that and say, no, he's not voting. The voting official is voting, isn't he? The man in the suit. But the answer was that you were not allowed to put your own ballot into the ballot box. The moderator or the election judge would do it for you after he checked to be sure there was only one, but that was done in front of you. That's how we kept people from stuffing the ballot box. But you'll also notice you see the glass ballot box, but there's something else you should really look at in this picture, and that is the crowd of people. Look at that crowd of people. Those people are not waiting in line to vote. This was done in a public place, and anybody who wanted to could just come watch the election, because why not? The election belonged to the people, and that was the way that you kept elections honest. Another thing that also was invented at some point along the line was the consecutive sign-in sheets, meaning that the people would sign in the order. This was very important in 1948 in Texas in the Senate primary runoff, where the last 200 votes were from people who, from voters who appeared in alphabetical order and used the same blue pen and had the same handwriting. And I think we all understand, we've all heard of 1948 and that infamous election. Another thing too that also happened with these was that the votes were counted in public. They were counted at the precinct immediately after closing the polls, and the counting was done immediately. There was no such thing as claiming there was a water leak, everybody out of here. No, they had the vote counts were done in the public. The next thing we have, this is a rather interesting one, in that there was a round hole rather than a slot. This was done in some early ballots, and the whole idea was if you wanted to cast a ballot into here, is you'd take your ballot and then you'd roll it up after you've, obviously I'd have to first mark the ballot. I'm not bothering. These are just pieces of paper here. But this little piece of paper here looks something like a ballot, and this is how you cast your ballot. Now, what if you wanted to try to vote more than once? If you tried to vote more than once and you thought you'd slip two ballots in here, and don't forget, many of these were used back in the days of tickets, meaning that you got your ticket outside before you came into the precinct to vote. So you could easily have brought in 2 or 3 tickets. This was before the ballot idea was invented. But now, as you see, I've got 2 pieces of paper in here. But these 2 pieces of paper, I've got 2. I'm just stuffing the ballot box. And it's a little tough to push it in there. But now, when the time comes to open the ballot box and start counting, we're going to find that this one that I just did into here, these 2 are together. And if these 2 ballots are together, then the typical penalty was both ballots were discarded because you were caught trying to stuff the ballot box and you weren't supposed to. Now this next one over here is another ballot box. Some of these were still in use in the early 1980s when I was voting. I've actually used one just like this as a voter in Manchester, New Hampshire. Now what happens in this case is there was a ballot box. The bell rang every time you cast a ballot. There was a little rubber stamp in here too. And there's also a counter in here. You remember all these other things that you have to do. How many people voted? How many ballots were cast according to the counter? How many ballots were cast when they opened up the box to get to them? All of these are some of the safeguards. And here I am. I'm about to cast a ballot. Now, I can actually force a couple ballots in at the same time, because you can do this, right? You can do this. However, remember there's also a rubber stamp in here. And so only one of these 2 ballots would have the rubber stamp on it. The other one, we'd know which one was not a legal ballot. So that's how you kept people from stuffing the ballot box. Believe it or not, the bell was once used to stop voting officials from stuffing the ballot box. It happened in Manchester, New Hampshire. They had a machine like this, and the 2 voting officials had decided to stuff the ballot box when nobody was around. So they looked around and everybody was gone, and so they started just stuffing the ballot box. They were throwing it in. They were crossing off the people's names off the checklist, like people that they knew had died or things like that. And so they were crossing them off, and they were doing that. Unbeknownst to them, a police officer had come by, and this particular police officer just stood outside the door, and he heard the bell, and then he heard the bell again, and then he heard the bell again, and he began to say, well, I don't see anybody coming in or going out. So he walked on in and he caught them in the act. And it's kind of funny because the only reason why they got caught was because this bell rang every time. So I guess the taxpayers were saved by the bell. Now we also have here, this is just the instructional model. This is not really a mechanical lever voting machine, but this was used for instructional models to show people how to vote if you had a mechanical lever voting machine. Now the first thing that the voter would do would be I'm just moving a little lever. In the real ones, it took 2 hands to move that, because you not only did this, which set up all of the mechanics in here to allow for that, it also closed a privacy curtain behind you. Now you could vote by pulling the party lever to vote for all the candidates, or you could just pick whichever candidates you want to vote for. I'll just take a few at random, vote yes or no on a couple questions, and now here they are. Now, what you do is you now move this big lever back. Now, when I move the lever back here, notice it resets all of these. It also opened the curtain so that the next voter could walk in. Now, what kept the voter from just suddenly pulling this lever over here and then voting again? Well, the thing was that on the side of this machine there was a button over on the right-hand side usually, and there was usually a very nice lady who would be standing there. And the funny thing was that you could not move that lever over to this position unless she was holding that button. So that's what kept people from, just going ahead and just stuffing the ballot box more than once, by voting more than once. And again, it was just another way to prevent stuffing the ballot box. There also was a voter counter on the side of the machine. You see, the votes that were inside of these machines looked a lot like an odometer on your car. They were made of plastic typically, but they could have been made of metal. The ones that I've seen were typically plastic, like a little odometer into there. But that one on the side was not resettable. You couldn't reset that one to 0 except with a lot of effort, usually a factory-trained technician. But that was designed to also count the number of voters that had used that particular piece of machinery. Now, but there still were some security threats in here, and probably the biggest security threat in these machines was for people on the inside who would put a non-zero vote total in there. It could be a down ballot race where you had the drop-offs, and so people would know I could just give somebody 20 votes here, 20 votes there, and people just won't notice. But another dirty trick of doing it was to set the odometer to perhaps, depending on how many digits, let's say you had 3 digits. If I gave you 990 votes and I gave myself 10, once 10 people voted for you, the odometer would switch over to 0. And you see, that's how I actually stole 20 votes, or stole 10, whatever, stole from you with doing that. That was the biggest threat. I've known of people who were poll watchers who were given great difficulty when people did not want to let them inspect the machine at the beginning for non-zero vote totals. And I know of one who held up an election, and once they opened it up, he did realize that they were not all set to 0. And the people who ran the election had to write down those numbers so that when they did get their numbers, they could adjust them. Now, when people vote using a DRE, that's that direct recording electronic, those totally computerized voting booths, you're typically given a code. Let's say it's a 3 or a 4-digit code, and this code, it's set to expire in about 15 minutes. That's also an adjustable time. But what happens is also that all of those machines had to be electronically wired together, because once a voter used the code on any one of those machines, all the other machines had to be notified that that code had been used and that that code was no longer valid, because otherwise people could have used that same code to go to different machines multiple times, which you really don't want. Now, some DREs had a paper trail and some didn't. The New American has been an advocate for the paper trail in the voting equipment since 1986, and don't expect any change in the editorial standpoint. Another form of voting is with an optical scan system. And depending on the manufacturer, each ballot has a unique serial number. And that unique serial number is stored in the machine whenever it is voted. And if you attempt to vote it again, it will refuse to count that particular vote. Now, it depends on the machine. It depends on the manufacturer. It depends if somebody has made adjustments to it. But those can be excellent means for making sure that the voters are not stuffing the ballot box. And also, depending on the state election laws, the ballots in many states are required by law to be numbered sequentially when they're given to the precincts. This protects from having somebody monkey with them, because if somebody is monkeying with these things and suddenly some strange ballots with strange ballot numbers show up, they will be traceable, and that protects against stuffing the ballot box. And some states demand that the votes be counted in the precinct immediately after closing the polls. Those are good measures. Well, we've looked at this equipment. We've looked at all of these things. We've looked at the procedures going all the way back to Roman times. So this paints a pretty good picture. It shows that people are taking care to keep people from cheating, whether it be the voters themselves or the voting officials, to keep them from cheating. And that's great. But what's gone wrong? Well, for one thing, we have to put a value, and a high value, on the purity of the election itself. We have to consider that to be something. We can't just say that we want so much to have everybody vote that we're going to just let just anybody vote, whether they're legal or not. We've also forgotten the value of that public access. Because it used to be, like we saw in that picture, in that lithograph from 1872, that lithograph showed that the public was there. Anybody who wanted to could just go to the polls, and we need to reinstate that, where people can go and watch their votes in their election, because we, the people, should own the electoral process. Today, we've forgotten about that, and we've come up with some very strict rules on who can be an observer. And we're finding that the rules are getting worse and worse, and poll watchers are being suppressed. And sometimes it's very difficult to get to be an official poll watcher. Another thing that we're also doing, it used to be that the election results had to be made public immediately. And now we're being told, well, we're going to protect them from hackers by encrypting them with strong encryption. Well, what good does that do? Because that's public information. What we really need to do is remember, it was immediate public disclosure of the totals. That's what keeps them from being tampered with. So another thing that's also gone wrong, we've also had some voter registration lists that really need cleanup. It's really getting to be a real mess, and it's really necessary. We're also allowing, when the people do the audits, like this recent audit in Arizona, in a lot of ways it was really good. For the most part, it really was great. It was wonderful. It's about time somebody did that. But why did they have non-disclosure agreements for everybody? Why do we audit behind closed doors? We should have had that audit being done where the newscasters could have said immediately, hey, we just talked to somebody who said that he was a supplier of paper for the paper ballots, and that somebody in a governmental position of authority has told him not to talk to the auditors. That should have been news right on the day that that happened. So another problem we're also having with these audits is that we're having audits where the voting officials are now auditing themselves. The problem is we need the auditing to be done by the public, not by people getting to write their own report cards. Another serious problem is this drop box voting. Voting should be done in the precinct. You should be signing in as to who you are, and these drop boxes are just an invitation to stuffing the ballot box. So what must be done? The John Birch Society is leading the way right now with the Restore Election Integrity program. And some of our steps that are mentioned are to make sure that voters get to monitor their elections, restricting the voting to either a paper ballot or electronically scanned, optical scanned ballots, which also are a paper ballot. We want to abolish early voting, and also to abolish same-day voter registration, and to also abolish ballot harvesting. And We'd also like to see much better implementation of voter ID requirements. And we'd like to repeal the Motor Voter Act and also to repeal the Help America Vote Act. This brings us to the big question, do the political parties really keep check on each other? Well, in the book Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley, you can find where he said, the two parties should be almost identical so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shift in policy. And so with that, I would just like to leave with you an encouragement. If you have not already contacted the John Birch Society to learn more about the Restore Election Integrity Project, to please do so at jbs.org.